Cheers! I'm Nicole Nigh Hondros, and I love making art. So, this year I made this groovy Revolver work of art in honor of the 50th anniversary of the album Revolver. This work, which has come to be known as Words of Revolver, is the album cover Revolver, made up entirely of words. There are no shapes or lines. It may look like a line. That kind of looks like a line. That's not just a line. There are letters. It's all incorporated into the letters. And those letters are all words. And those words are all songs. And they are the 14 songs on the British version of the Beatles' Revolver album. This year I went with the same thing that Klaus used. I went with his pen and ink because really it's Revolver, and I wanted to do it proper homage. But I put the lyrics into the piece because they were also part of what made Revolver great in the first place. And actually I do have some stats right here. One album, 14 songs, 2,233 words, 10,808 characters make up this work of art. No lines, no random shapes, no Chinese, only the lyrics. And I brought with me my trusty pen and ink. Here's my Dr. P.H. Martin's ink. And I chose Dr. P.H. Martin's because I saw Beatle artist Ron Campbell, who in the Beatle world did the Yellow Submarine animation. But in the real world, he's more widely known for things like Rugrats, Flintstones, Jetsons. He worked on all that stuff. And when I saw him, met him, he was working with Dr. P.H. Martin's ink. It's a very goopy sort of ink. It quickly destroyed my pens. On the tip of my pen, I have this thing called a nib. It destroyed 4 of them in this particular process. My little nib up there would get really goopy, and I'd clean it, and eventually it just broke from all the cleaning. So it took 4 nibs to make Words of Revolver. Let's go into math, because every good artwork needs some math. I knew how many characters were in it, 10,808, and I knew that it was going to be a square, because the album cover is a square. That meant I got to take a really freaking big square root. Fortunately, they make calculators. Unfortunately, the square root of 10,808 is something like 104, 4 or 5, I can't completely remember, somewhere in there. Point some endless decimal. It probably does not end. I don't know. It didn't end on my calculator. So I had to round, and that's great, but I couldn't make my piece because once you got the square root, you had to make a grid of a square that was exactly 104 point blah, 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 blah by 104 point blah, 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 blah. And that really doesn't lend itself so well to making a perfect grid that you're going to lay letters into, because how do I make a point whatever blah, blah, blah of a letter? You can't do it. They only come in whole sizes letters. It's math lesson time. What is a square root for you non-mathematicians? Well, it has to do basically with the concept of area, at least in this case it does. And what I mean by that is, say you have a square that has a measurement of 9. In order to have a square with a measurement and area of 9, area is the length times the width, the 2 sides multiplied by each other. And to get to your 9 for your area, you would have 3 times 3. So let's look at my kitchen floor. Can you see all 9 squares here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Ooh, I should have cleaned my kitchen floor. Okay, that's better. Can you see my 9 squares?
Yes.
Okay, so I've got my 9 squares. That has an area of 9, but you'll notice my side is 1 square, 2 square, 3 square. And this side is 1 squares, 2 squares, 3 squares. So 3 by 3. There are 10,000, did I say 888? Something like that. Over 10,000 characters in this work of art. So we call the area 10,880, I think it was. If that's the area, the sides both have to be equal. and multiply together to get that area of 10,000 and some change. Now, if the area had been 10,000, I actually think I could have gotten, is 100 times 100 10,000? Yes, it is. So if it had actually been a nice even 10,000, I could have had a nice even side 100 by 100. But of course, with the extra 888 on there, I ended up with roughly 104 plus these little leftover decimals. So I had to kind of fudge the top and bottom measurements a little bit. So welcome back from the math lesson. Now that we know what a square root is and how we figured out how many squares I needed in this piece, I found a really high resolution, already on the internet, picture of the album cover. I took that, I put it into Photoshop, and I created my own grid. I put up the Photoshop guidelines, which were not the correct size, and I did a bunch of resizing things until they were in like the right places. And I dragged a bunch of lines over because the guidelines don't actually print, and literally created my own grid. And that was the beginning of the pattern for this work. Once I had that, I took it over to the print shop, Office Depot, and had them run it off on their giant printer. Their giant printer can print to about, I think it's 3 feet wide you can get on their giant printer. This is 4 feet wide. That's not good. So before I could have them print it, I had to actually split it in half. And we printed 2 sections that were 4 feet by 2 feet. And that was like pattern number 1. I purchased a light board. The biggest one I could get was about 18 inches long, so it only did, might have been a little longer than that, but it only did a small section of the piece at a time. And I took that first Revolver album with the grid on it, I put my second big piece of paper on top, taped it together, double-sided tape, and proceeded to trace using the light board. But I wasn't just tracing. This was obviously, instead of doing an exact replica of the Revolver album, because what would have really been the point to doing that, especially if I was going to sit there and trace it. If I was going to hand draw it, maybe, but sitting there and tracing it, that would have just been a waste of everyone's time. So instead of tracing it, I systematically began turning it into letters. I basically drew this in pencil, and I really didn't know it was going to work until I finished the pattern. So I was a good 2 months into the process before I was able to stand back and look at it and say, yeah, this is going to work. So, which was crazy because that was a lot of work and kind of going, that was so nerve-wracking the first time. I was like, okay, this is the moment I'm going to be able to tell if I just wasted 2 months or not. So, yeah, I was really happy I hadn't wasted my 2 months. But so I had the light board, and I was tracing it, making the pattern. I finally knew it was going to work. So the second half of the pattern was a lot more exciting to do than the first, because the first one was just a lot of, like, nerves. But then as I started to get closer to the bottom, remember that decimal, and I had fudged the lines. I started going, okay, I calculated this. I think I have exactly the right amount of squares. What if I come to the bottom and I find out I'm a row too short? What if I can't fit the last song in? And I wasn't going to know until I got down there if it was going to work or not work, or how much I was going to have to scrunch things up, and it wasn't going to look very good scrunchy. I mean, you've got this perfect pretty grid here. It would be pretty obvious if I started scrunching it up at the bottom where there's a whole lot more white going on. But what am I going to do if it's wrong?